Friends, welcome to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It's not difficult for you, but it's nice for me, and we're starting. Jack Boston is a competent member of the Potters Bridge Village cricket team, a good batter in the middle line and a good versatile player. In his youth, he even played for Northamptonshire Cricket Club, but nothing came of it. Potters Bridge is a large village in the inner counties. It is 40 miles from London and is quite prosperous. Jack is married to Wendy. Wendy is something like a blonde bombshell. A pretty face, a rounded ass, big breasts and legs that seem endless. She's a little flirtatious at cricket club parties, but she's being honest. Wendy knows how to stand up for herself and enjoys Jack's full confidence. He had never thought about the possibility that she was cheating on him. And why would I? Personally, he would never cheat on her, so she would never cheat on him. It's simple. They had both just turned 30. Jack is quite tall and well-built. Ladies consider him handsome, and men consider him a good athlete. He has no enemies that he knows about. But things can change, can't they? Jack works in the field of information technology at his father's firm, Times 1000, and is a qualified IT troubleshooting specialist, one of the best in the industry. He was amused, but also flattered, that one of the girls in the village had become his shadow since about the age of 12. For some reason, Sarah Clark was fascinated by computers and information technology. Sarah doesn't get along too well with the other children in the village. She moved in with her grandmother in a cute chocolate box cottage on the edge of the cricket field when she was 8. There was no hostility towards her from the other children or from her towards them. She just wasn't interested in boys or girls. And instead of having fun at the village disco in the church hall, she plunged into studying information technology, assembled computers herself, installed her own wireless networks, etc. The other kids were even proud of her for being their special geek. Now, at the age of 18, she is a very pretty young maiden, as the locals call attractive girls. When she turned 16 and graduated from high school, she contacted Jack to find out if there were any vacancies in the company owned by his family. For her? Of course they are. Jack liked Sarah, and after asking her about her computer knowledge, he realized that he would have to allocate a place for her. Wendy liked Sarah too, and although she teased Jack about having a little girlfriend, Jack understood that Wendy was just joking. After all, many people in the village described Wendy and Jack as the perfect couple, right? And they even talked about having children. Over the next month or so, Wendy was going to give up the pills, and they would let nature take its course. The KKP, Potters Bridge Cricket Club, was, along with the Cricketers' Hands pub, the center of the village's social life. This was especially true of the more affluent members of society: doctors, lawyers, architects, company directors, and the like. All of them were members of the KKP. The less well-off villagers, some of whom could not stand the nobility, as a rule, avoided the hothouse atmosphere of the KKP and its chic and elegant clubhouse, and either drank at the Cricketers' Hands bar, where they always used the original and ancient name of the pub Distiller's Rest, outraged by the senseless name change caused by a deal with the brewery that owned the pub and the RCMP committee, or at the Service Club, which was a joint military establishment frequented by a pair of retired colonels and a former commander of the Royal Navy, although the bulk of the club's members were retired sergeants, other ranks, and several active military personnel. As for Jack, his life with Wendy was idyllic. They have a large modern house. Jack lived in a beautiful, soothing, and comfortable pink fog. They made love regularly, that is, they made love often. It was spontaneous and great. Sometimes Wendy refused to make love because she was too tired to make love. And in such cases it was quite easy for Jack to hug her until they both fell asleep. Jack's father still remained the managing director of the family firm, although he handed over the day-to-day work to the company's president, George Murphy, who was promoted from CFO to president. His father spent most of his free time involved in the management of the cricket club, of which he was chairman. His wife was the president of the women's group at the cricket club, and they both enjoyed the social life that revolved around the club, from monthly lottery nights to annual dinners with dancing. Jack didn't resent the fact that such an important role was assigned to an outsider, although he knew he should have resented it. In truth, Jack wanted to be left to do what he likes and what he does best: manage the company's IT systems. Somehow, Sarah's summer internship turned into a permanent, albeit part-time one. The company funded her studies for a degree in ICT, information and communication technologies, through distance learning and, if Jack had had anything to do with it, she would have quickly enrolled in a master's degree. Some women at work teased Jack, calling Sarah his faithful puppy. They didn't want to offend anyone with their comments, but there was some truth behind them. There was something puppy-like about her devotion to Jack, but Jack didn't notice this because he was completely fixated on the love of his life, the beautiful, loving Wendy. Well, it's clear that this is going to end badly, right? Despite her youth and lack of experience with boys, Sarah knew a lot more than anyone would have guessed. Sarah moved in with her grandmother because her parents ruined their marriage by cheating on each other with multiple partners, and then, as idiots often do, chose to blame each other instead of taking responsibility for the fiasco that each of them helped turn their marriage into. Even at the age of 8, Sarah knew the truth about her parents, about what cheating was, and about the trouble and pain it could cause. She went to live with her mother's mother because her parents didn't know how to live with a little girl who had both been very, very let down. So, to their shame, they relinquished responsibility for their only child and entered into a temporary agreement, just for a few weeks, Mom. Until things work out between Matthew and me. It has become something much more permanent. In fact, Sarah considered her grandmother to be a greater mother than her own mother had ever been. Of course, from the time Sarah turned 6, and when eventually her parents' marriage crashed on the rocks of infidelity on both sides, she rarely saw either of her parents. And I didn't miss them, for that matter. Each of them had new partners, and they seemed to treat Sarah as an annoying relic of their failed marriage. As a result, Sarah's grandmother chose to have very little in common with her own daughter. So, as a result, Sarah knew a lot about cheating. She had a sixth sense for it. I realized it when I saw it. She had a nose for her, you might say. Sarah knew Wendy was cheating on Jack. In Sarah's opinion, there is a strong smell of betrayal around her. Having learned to deal with her parents, Sarah knew enough not to show Wendy that she knew what she was up to. Besides, Jack will need hard evidence before he decides which course of action to take. And Sarah, with her knowledge of computers and related fields, will provide him with this evidence. Sarah was patient. It should be. She didn't want anything to go wrong with her plans. And yes, Sarah did have plans. Not the plans of a girl her age, but the plans of a woman who is still young, but in many ways has aged prematurely. Wendy will get hers. And so is she, Sarah thought. One morning in early summer, Jack was on his way to work in London when Sarah called him. Jack, hi, this is Sarah. Hi, Sarah. What can I do for you? Jack, I'm sorry to bother you. I know you're on your way to work, but I need you to please come back to the village. There is something very bad here, terribly wrong. Please come back. She seemed upset, on the verge of tears, which in itself was unusual. Jack wondered what the hell it could be. Is there a problem with the boy? What? Are you in trouble? What is it? He asked, feeling uneasy for his young protege. I know, Jack. Not with me. But there is a problem. You have to come back. I just have to come back. Right now. I'll be waiting for you in the parking lot of the cricket club. Please hurry up. But don't tell anyone. No one at all. Okay. I'll be back in about 15 minutes. I haven't gone very far towards London, so I'll be back as soon as I can. They cut the connection, and Jack's powerful Mercedes compressor coupe made it back to the village in just over 10 minutes. He found her at the far end of the parking lot, hidden by a hedge. He locked the car with the remote control and walked over to her. He realized that she looked upset, ready to cry. Sarah, what the hell is wrong? What happened to you? She shook her head. Nothing happened to me. It's not something that's happening to me. You have to come with me to the cricket club building. Be as quiet as possible, and whatever we find, please, please promise that you won't do anything stupid. Please? What the hell had she discovered? Are some kids using it to smoke dope? He had suspicions that the clubhouse had been used for something illegal several times, but there was never any concrete evidence. He's probably my best friend Steve's son. I really need to talk to Steve about his boy, he thought. The front door was locked, but Jack realized that someone was inside, as he noticed that the light on the alarm was not flashing, which means that the alarm was not activated. Shh. Do everything quietly. Sarah, who was standing next to him, coaxed. He grinned slightly and unlocked the door with his bunch of keys. He was in charge of training the youth, as quietly as I could. They crept through the large lobby, passing notices on both sides of the hall detailing the dates and times of network training, youth team classes, club dinner with dancing, and the like. There were 3 doors in front of them, and Sarah patted his hand and pointed to the door to the club lounge. With its luxurious leather chairs, it always reminded Jack of an exclusive gentleman's club in London, which was pretty much what his father was aiming for. They opened the door, went inside, and Jack's world collapsed. The room was filled with a large group of men, all to varying degrees, but all without trousers, and only one woman. His Wendy. Wendy was the center of the room, naked and sitting like a horsewoman on the lap of his supposed best friend, Steve Markham, chairman of the cricket club. It's strange how everything strikes a person at this first moment of discovery. Heck, the silence in the room crackled. It was broken by Sarah, who gasped, "My God! Oh my God! Jack,
Saw thee.
I thought she was cheating on you only with Steve, but the whole cricket team just used it." Wendy squealed softly and shouted, "My husband is here." Jack was speechless. The shock of seeing what had escaped from the cheater who had previously been his wife took him by surprise. He vomited right on the carpet, splattering the bare legs of the 2 fools, and on Steve's patent leather shoes, which he absurdly kept on using his friend's wife. At that moment, the door to the men's room opened, and a thick, juicy, and affected voice intensely said, "What's going on? Why did the fun stop? Oh, damn it." Jack looked wildly to his left and realized that the portly naked figure of his father had just entered the living room. "You were with everyone at the cricket club except me, you fool. Even with my own father." "Oh, Wendy, you're a fool. How could you?" The combination of her own body's desire to get rid of the interfering liquid and gravity caused the battle to be lost. She turned pale from shock. It's not what you think, Jack. Don't listen to this fool." She pointed to Sarah, who was standing to Jack's right. Sarah was still deeply shaken by what she had just witnessed. "Go away," Jack shouted. "Sarah didn't tell me anything. She just asked me to meet her here. And look what I found. An original pastime. For everyone. And I say," the preacher's voice intoned, "there's no need to address a lady in that tone." "Oh, my God," Jack shouted. "The vicar? You fool. You conducted our wedding ceremony. You made us say these oaths of loyalty. How could you help her cheat on me, you fool?" No one else said anything. Wendy looked at Jack, and tears streamed down her face, and she shook her head. Jack turned, grabbed Sarah, and ran back out the door. Once in the fresh air, he felt very sick again. "Oh, my God, Sarah, why didn't you warn me about this?" She looked up at him with tears glistening in her eyes. "Jack, please believe me. I had no idea they were having this giant threesome. All I thought was that Wendy had arranged to meet Steve here for a date. I knew she was cheating on you. But, use me. Not with all your cricket club buddies. And isn't that fat fool who came out of the swamp your own father?" Jack smiled grimly when he heard her describe his father. Sarah walked around the side of the building, bent down, opened a small external locker, and took out a portable drive and a mini receiver, which she put in her pocket. "I wrote it all down. HD video, stereo sound. I had several video cameras and microphones hidden in my room. Don't worry. It has a certificate for use in court cases." By this time, they had reached Jack's car. Sarah squeezed his hand reassuringly. "You have nothing to worry about, Jack. You can come and stay with me and my grandmother. She sheltered me when I became a victim of my stupid parents' infidelity. So, you see, she has experience caring for victims of infidelity. She will accept you." And so it happened. The cottage looked like a TARDIS in the sense that it seemed bigger on the inside than it looked on the outside. Jack was given a bedroom at the back of the house. "You'd better not occupy a room with a view of the cricket field," Mrs. Clark opined, after listening with an ashen face to the story of Jack's betrayal. The problem for Jack was that his entire social and professional support network was ripped out from under his feet. His wife, his best friend, the vicar, his father, his own doctor, and the family lawyer. Jack felt that they were all conspiring to destroy him. And even if not, the result was the same. He was destroyed. He drove to a town 15 miles away, and visited a National Health Service clinic. When he told the sympathetic doctor there that his own doctor of medicine had been caught using his wife, the doctor on duty gave him a certificate of health, indicating that, in his opinion, he could not work for a month. He also wrote him a prescription for paroxetine, diagnosed Jack with post-traumatic stress disorder, and organized an STD test at the genitourinary clinic at a local hospital. Somehow Jack turned out to be clean, but not because Wendy made love to 11 other men without protection, he mused. The doctor also handed Jack a brochure on how to file a complaint against a doctor. "I hope you nail this fool," said the doctor, adding, "Figuratively speaking, of course." He asked Sarah how she found out about Wendy's cheating. Sarah looked sad, saying, "Watching my own mom and dad. They didn't exactly have an open marriage, they just cheated on each other, and with several partners. I began to notice certain behaviors that were common to both of them. I realized that your wife was starting to exhibit the same behaviors as my stupid parents, and I just knew she was cheating. How did you find out?" She grinned. "Oh, I put voice-activated dictaphones in her purse and car. That's how I found out about her and Steve. I'm so sorry that I didn't find out about this threesome after all. To be honest, it shocked me. I believe she left her purse in the car when they were planning her event at the cricket club together." He looked doubtful. "Isn't what you did illegal?" She shrugged her shoulders. "Maybe. However, the recording I made at the cricket club will be legal if we make a slight stretch. You expressed concern that you thought someone was illegally using the cricket club buildings, so you asked me to install a security system. Well, it's not your fault if you forgot to mention it to your wife or other members of the club, is it?" He laughed. "Oh, my God, Sarah. It's pretty clever. I'm glad you're on my side." "I've always been on your side, Jack," she said with a mysterious smile on her face. The whole village was buzzing with rumors that something had happened, but no one knew the exact truth. Although the continued absence of Jack's Mercedes in the driveway has caused a lot of rumors, most of the villagers did not know where the car was, as it was parked in an old stable behind the cottage, away from prying eyes. All Jack wanted to do was sit and mope and try to drown himself out with a lot of whiskey. But he understood that this would be a bad way to handle the situation. Over a cup of tea, sitting at a scrubbed white pine table in front of his grandmother's Aga Swedish stove, he talked to an elderly woman. "Mabel, I want to get drunk and stay drunk. But why should I let my cheating wife and these pathetic fools, whom I took for friends, dictate to me how I should live?" She nodded and took a sip of tea and said, "There is no reason at all for this. You need to stay strong and healthy for your own sake. You haven't talked to your wife yet, have you?" He shook his head. "No, I didn't tell you, but I guess I'll have to." He called Wendy on her cell phone. The conversation was short and to the point. "It looks like this fool is mad at me. God, now she's going to blame me," he thought. They agreed that he would visit the house later that day. The meeting was tense. They were sitting in the living room, staring at each other, and each was waiting for the other to start. In the end, Wendy started. "Jack, I'm really sorry that you saw this." Sarah had no right. Jack shouted. "Fuck off, Wendy. Don't blame Sarah for what you did. She didn't force you to make love to 11 of my so-called friends. You did it. But why did you interfere?" Wendy said irritably. "Because you did something you obviously don't do. She took care of me. She took enough care of my interests while you enjoyed your new life as a fucking village bike." Wendy's face flushed. "I'm not a country bike." "Oh, okay, Wendy," Jack chuckled. "I apologize. You're just a cricket club bike." "What do you want, Jack?" "What is it?" she asked. "To be honest, I think I want to get a divorce." Wendy gasped. "Get a divorce? But why?" He leaned back in his chair and, throwing up his hands, slapped them on his head. "Good God, woman. I caught you with 11 of my former friends. The question is not why I might want a divorce, but why I shouldn't want a fucking divorce. Can't we get over this? Relive the fact that you've had love with 11 men? That you allowed, even encouraged them to say all sorts of nasty things about me? That you laughed when they bullied me? How is it? Wendy, please tell me. How can we get through this? Please tell me. How do I get through this? Could we ask Dr. Collins to arrange a consultation for us?" Wendy sounded hopeful. "You're a damn idiot," Jack shouted. You seem to have forgotten that I can't go to this Doug Collins anymore because he's one of the people who used you. Wendy flinched at these words. Toe, I'm sorry. I hadn't thought of that. You didn't think about a lot of things, you fool. I wish you'd show me some respect. Wendy snapped. Jack's expression was priceless. To show it. Respect? What the fuck do you mean? Oh, wait. I'll show you some disrespect. He got up, went to the coffee table, took her iPad, turned it on, inserted a USB stick into it, and showed her the video that Sarah had recorded. Wendy watched this, and tears streamed down her face. Dear God. Oh, dear God. No wonder you want to divorce me. But you shouldn't have seen or heard any of this. None of us wanted to disrespect you. It was just harmless fun. Has it gone too far? Too far? God, that's putting it mildly, if I've ever heard of such a thing. He shook his head. I can't forgive you for this, Wendy. I'll never be able to come to terms with it. Why? Because if you just had an affair with Steve, that would have been bad enough. But you've been in love with 11 men. If you had just settled on one lover, I might have been able to get over it. But what you did while making love to 11 other men, I can't compare to that in my mind. Because the law of averages says that of these 11 men, some, of course, made love better than me. Any normal man who has a cheating spouse only needs to come to terms with the fact that when they make love, their spouse can, albeit unwillingly, compare his stupid, deceived spouse with his lover. But I don't have that luxury, do I? Wendy? At that moment, Wendy really burst into tears. She tried to speak, but only a few words could be made out. The predominant one is, I'm sorry. While she was crying, he went up to the bedroom that they used to share and emptied his part of the closet and the drawers of his dressing table. He packed everything in a couple of suitcases and took his clothes to his new home, leaving Wendy feeling upset in the living room. Later that day, Jack had a terrible meeting with his parents. They were sitting in the large kitchen of their equally large house. In his parents' house, where he grew up, Jack always felt comfortable and at home. Now he felt like an outsider. I didn't feel at home there anymore. Before he could say anything, his mother stepped in. Jack, I feel like we owe you an explanation. Over the past few years, the romantic life between your father and me has gone downhill a lot. This is due to the fact that I went through menopause. However, your father still has a high love interest. He overheard your friend Steve talking to Doug Collins about their plans to have fun with Wendy at the cricket club, and instead of putting an end to it, he asked if he could join in. Jack realized that this was another level of betrayal that he hadn't counted on. Mom, did you know in advance that he was planning to make love to my wife? His mother looked at Jack with a look that was impossible to read. Yes, Jack, I have to be honest and say that I really knew. If both of you can't make love anymore because it's inconvenient for Mom, then you could go to the pharmacy and buy a tube of KE jelly, you fools. And don't use my wife as a fool. Jack's father said, show some respect in my house. If you don't stop swearing, I will. Jack interrupted him with a shout. What? What are you going to do? Did you hurt me? You're a dumb jerk. Nothing you can do will hurt me more than to find out that you are one of my wife's 11 lovers. I'm not going to put up with your shit anymore. You're not my parents anymore. Goodbye. The next morning, he called a lawyer's office in the nearby town of Bankridge by phone. Gaines and Leper Legal Advice. How can I help you? Said a cheerful voice. Hello. I would like to make an appointment with a partner in your firm to start the divorce process, please. Let me put you through to our Mr. Rawlings' secretary. He's our divorce expert. 10 minutes later, he had an appointment for the beginning of the day. Obviously, there was a late cancellation. Lucky. He typed out a list of adulterers and shook his head. None of this seemed real. Dr. Doug Collins, our doctor, Peter Chappell, our lawyer, Nigel Boston, my father, Peter Brickman, Reverend Barry Cotter, our vicar, Will Downton, Clayton Smith, Arthur Harris, Steve Markham, former best friend, Patrick Smee, Donald Ross. When he handed the list to David Rawlings, the divorce expert at Gaines and Leper, Rawlings' eyes bulged. He said, it's a very long list. For how long had these men been her lovers? Jack swallowed and replied, actually, only that morning. Although she was with Steve Markham for a while before that. That morning? Dear God, what did she do? Made love to cricket? Oh, dear God. Oh my God. With the cricket team, isn't it? This is the Potter's Bridge Cricket Club. With your own father? Christ. I'm sorry for you, young man. Do you have any proof? Jack inserted a USB flash drive into his iPad and let Mr. Rawlings watch the video. He started taking notes. At some point, he paused the video, called his secretary, and asked her to cancel and reschedule the rest of his meetings for the day. Then I started the video again. Almost 2 hours later, when the video ended, this is when Sarah removed the receiver and the drive. He sighed and put down the pen. It's terrible. No wonder you want to name all these fools. Jack signed a contract with his company, and they began divorce proceedings based on adultery with 11 different men. In the UK, it is not necessary to use court couriers. A first-class position is usually sufficient. But Rawlings wanted to file a divorce petition using old-fashioned couriers to loudly announce adultery, hoping to embarrass them in addition to public humiliation. Theoretically, a divorce in the UK could be obtained in about 6 months, but the fact that Jack wanted to go for the option of nuclear revenge meant that everything was postponed. However, revenge fell on several people long before the start of the divorce hearing, not to mention the final decision of the court. The vicar was deprived of the right to reside in the parish, the doctor was dismissed by his colleagues in practice, and is awaiting trial at the BMA for inappropriate contact with a patient, and their family lawyer was suspended from practicing law pending a hearing on ethics and professional status in the law society. And yet he continued on his not very cheerful way. Several cheaters tried to remove their name from the divorce petition, but their lawyers had to admit their failure. As the judge said, your client was recorded making love to a friend's wife. The fact that an offended husband decides to file for divorce against all his wife's partners on charges of an affair should not, in my opinion, raise any questions about the legality of his actions, which, to be honest, are entirely justified. Sarah tried to avoid Wendy as much as she could, but eventually there was a sort of denouement at the village store. Sarah was entering the store while Wendy was walking towards the exit. Harsh words were said, mostly from Wendy. In the end, Wendy screamed, "You're trying to steal my husband from me, you fool. Why? What do you have that I don't?" Sarah was actually a non-confrontational child, the reason for which was the isolation from her life in connection with moving to her grandmother. But this time she was hurt, and she had to answer. "What do I have, Wendy? Let me tell you what I have, okay?" Several events happened at the same time. Sarah realized that she would have preferred that this remark had not been made. The people in the store booed approvingly in response to Sarah's remark, and Wendy, sobbing, fled the scene. This confrontation angered Jack. "She had no right to tell you that, Sarah. No right at all. Do you want me to ask Mr. Rawlings to issue an order forbidding her to approach you?" "Damn it, no," Sarah exclaimed. "Of course not. I doubt she'll bother me again." And so it was. After a whole year, the final court decision was made, and the marriage was dissolved, as well as several other marriages at the cricket club. Collateral damage, you might say. That's when Sarah invited Jack to have a drink at the Drover's Rest. "Jack, this is to celebrate your freedom." He nodded, and they clinked glasses. "Jack," she asked uncertainly, "what do you think of me as a woman?" The question caught him off guard, so his answer was perhaps more explicit than it could have been. Perhaps that's why Sarah asked this question the way she did. "You're a very beautiful young woman, Sarah." "Oh, I hope I'm not." She cut him off. "No, you're not. I'm glad you think I'm beautiful. I think you're handsome too, Jack. Very handsome indeed." "You really, Sarah? I had no idea. When did you discover this?" "I've liked you since the first time I saw you." By the end of the pub visit, they had officially become a couple. Some people were surprised by their relationship. She was almost 20, he was 32. But most people in the village thought it was a sweet story, and that Jack deserved a little happiness. One day they were talking and Jack asked Sarah if they could make love. Sarah blushed like a beetroot and stammered, "Oh, Jack, I have to admit, I'm still a virgin." He smiled at her and said, "Well, that's interesting news, Sarah. It just means that I'll have to speed up the process a bit." He got down on one knee and proposed to her, giving her a gorgeous wedding ring. She agreed, and tears streamed down her face. The pre-wedding interview with the new vicar, no one in the village cared where the previous one, Reverend Cotter, had gone, was interesting. After talking for a few minutes, Sarah shyly turned to the vicar. Actually, vicar, I have something to tell you. I'm a virgin. The vicar smiled and nodded. Well, that's good. Quite a rare thing, but, in my opinion, a very good one. She added, I've known Jack for many years and realized that I was in love with him, but he was married. But I knew that his then wife would cheat on him sooner or later. It was only a matter of time. She squeezed Jack's hand and smiled at him. Jack looked at her and said, Well, what if Wendy hadn't cheated on me? Then I'd have to die an old maid without ever having a man in the biblical sense of the word. The vicar smiled and said, This is love and devotion. The wedding was in summer. The day was warm, but not too hot. Sarah wore white not only to follow tradition, but also because it was her right as a virgin. Her grandmother gave her away in marriage, and most of the village ran away. Wendy was also present at the wedding. She was hanging around the back of the church, watching her handsome ex-husband marry his beautiful bride. Tears welled up in her eyes as she thought, I can't blame Sarah for what happened. I was a damn fool to listen to Steve Markham's pleas. And fuck knows why I let him convince me to let the whole cricket team in, especially Jack's own father. It was such a stupid idea. Jack would have found out sooner or later anyway. The honeymoon started at a hotel in Barmouth, on the coast of mid-Wales. That evening, in the honeymoon suite, Jack stood naked and watched as his young and shy bride took off her wedding dress to show off her beautiful new underwear, which she put on especially for him. Jack, she said, you know this is my first time. I'm not going to insult you by saying stuff like, please don't hurt me, because I love you and trust you enough to know that you will never hurt me intentionally. But I have one request, my love. Okay, which one? He asked. The first time we make love, let it be without a condom, okay? And I know what you're going to say, but if I get pregnant on our honeymoon, then so be it. Come on, Jack. Love me. And he did it. 9 months later, they proudly rolled their baby boy around the village, who was named Harry, in honor of the grandfather who died before Sarah was born. Life was good. Wendy came to the appointment a little earlier than the scheduled time. She climbed the stairs in a building that began life as a Georgian-style townhouse, and now has become home to many offices and operating rooms of a dentist, a private single doctor. The practice of a single doctor in the UK National Health Service was cancelled after Dr. Harold Shipman killed more than 250 of his elderly patients before then he was caught. 2 orthopedists and a consultant who had his own office on the 3rd floor. It was to him that Wendy came. An old-fashioned brass plaque read, Paul Walton, Ph.D., master's degree, consultant. She opened the door and went inside. The room was a small office without an entrance hall with a small desk and a chair behind it. There were a couple of hardback chairs against the wall facing the desk. The room was decorated in muted and soothing pastel colors, and there were a couple of large paintings on the wall. One of them was a playful caricature in the manner of a Rorschach test. The other was a view of a Norwegian fjord. She noticed a button on the table that said, Please press. She pressed the button, and before she could sit down on one of the chairs, the inner door opened and a man came out. He wasn't classically handsome, but if she needed love, she thought he would be suitable. Although she wasn't looking for love and probably never will be, she realized in an instant. Hello. My name is Paul Walton. He spoke in an authoritative, but at the same time soothing voice. I'm Wendy Boston. Ah. Yes, I have an appointment for you at 2 o'clock. Come into the inner office. She followed him into a room that repeated the decor scheme in the waiting room. Although there was something that spoke to Paul's obvious sense of humor, there was a large comic strip, Little Potbellied, depicting Lucy in her booth with a modified inscription, Psychologist on site. Even in her somewhat depressed mood, this made Wendy smile briefly. I see you liked my comic. It was written for me by my friend, a talented artist. I suppose, strictly speaking, it violates copyright laws, but since everything said or seen in these consulting rooms is confidential information, how would they even know? He sat her down in a deep and very comfortable leather armchair in front of his large, uncluttered desk. He sat down himself and looked at her. Well, Wendy, why don't you tell me what you need help with? And please address me by my first name, Paul. I am a doctor only when I attend conferences. She swallowed and began. My husband divorced me, and it's completely my fault. I did something very, very bad, unforgivable. Actually, he looked at her. And you want him to come back? To somehow overcome this and come back to you? She shook her head sadly. I'm afraid that ship has already sailed. Ideally, yes, I would really like that. But now I know it's not even a pipe dream. Okay, Paul said, why don't you start at the beginning? So she did. It all started with a little flirtation at the cricket club. Well, I mean, there was nothing too serious about it. It never got out of hand. We all knew the limits we could reach before it became too stupid and dangerous for our marriages. I could have scared off the more persistent ones with a well-chosen joke or a clever attack. Until one day, something was said between me and Steve Markham, my husband's best friend, and suddenly everything between us became very serious. We agreed to meet for a cup of coffee at our house. I work from home. Steve has a flexible schedule. His wife works in a city a few miles away. My husband, Jack, works in London. And if anyone sees Steve coming to our house, well, what of it? We were all friends and neighbors, and since I was on the women's cricket club committee and Steve was a member of the club committee, so what if we had coffee? And I honestly thought that was all I had in mind, having a cup of coffee with Steve. And that's how it was? Paul asked softly but firmly. She shook her head. And no, it wasn't like that. I'm afraid to say, but one thing led to another, and we ended up in bed together. Steve took the initiative. He was a kind, considerate lover, but he wasn't supposed to be one, was he? I cheated on my husband. I've never cheated on my husband before. Never. And yet here I am, lying in bed with my husband's best friend. And even worse, we're lying in our marital bed, where Jack and I made love. And I ruined our marital bed by making love to another man in it. I let him spew his seed into me. And it was his best friend. I had barely begun to cry bitterly because of my betrayal of my husband, when Steve took me in his arms and comforted me, saying that what I was feeling was guilt, and that, although it was completely natural, it destroyed consciousness. He said that nothing terrible would happen, since we only had an hour or so of pleasure, and that if Jack never found out, then everything would be fine. When I told him that I felt guilty for letting him experience a moment in me, and on our marital bed, he explained that it was better than if we sneaked away and made love in bed in the guest bedroom or somewhere in a motel. He said that if we sneaked out and did it this way, it would mean that we both know we're doing something wrong, something underground and dirty. Then he said he knew I was taking pills, so it wasn't love at all, which would have been much, much worse if he had brought condoms with him, because that would have been a deliberate act of pre-planning infidelity, that we did not plan to change in advance, but only planned to have a cup of coffee, and that everything developed naturally, coming to its beautiful and logical conclusion. When I said that I felt I had to confess to Jack, he rejected the idea, saying that Jack would never understand this, that any relationship between the two of us would not pose a possible threat to our marriage, and that telling him about it would only upset him unnecessarily. So I agreed that we would keep it a secret, and we also agreed to meet again for a cup of coffee later that week. Paul nodded and said, "Please continue." Wendy swallowed and spoke again. So, we got into the habit of meeting for a cup of coffee and then making love in my marital bed. We always had coffee in advance. I don't know why. Perhaps it was a way to normalize what we were doing, to make it not seem like treason to me. After a couple of months of this affair, Steve asked me a question. He asked if I had ever thought about having two lovers at the same time. I said the idea was disgusting, but he insisted, and for about an hour, when we were both lying in ours, well, anyway, in my bed, he turned me on so much that I agreed to at least try. He explained that it would help me in my marriage, help me explore myself as a sensual being. We arranged a special date for the three of us, Steve, me and some other people from the cricket club, Doug, our family doctor. We decided that we would do it at the cricket club, in the living room, and we did it. To my shame, I have to say that it was really very, very pleasant. I knew Jack should never find out about this, because it would break his heart. I told Steve and Doug how wonderful it was, and there was a certain look between the two of them. "What are you up to here?" I asked with a smirk on my face. They smiled and said they would come up with a plan that would help me realize my fantasy of a really good and large portion of liquid. I felt so excited, but I didn't realize it was my fantasy until Steve arranged for him and Doug to take me in together. Paul nodded. Of course, as always, he was open-minded. but it seemed to him that he had a good idea of how this story would develop. What happened next, Wendy? They said they would arrange a special treat for me. They decided to invite all the guys from the cricket club to whom they thought they could entrust a special session with me. I was so nervous that on the morning of my adventure, I was physically ill. Somehow I was able to behave normally around Jack. Well, I guess the truth was that I had been cheating on him with Steve for so long that pretending to be his loving, faithful wife became second nature to me. But it was still partly true. I was still his loving wife, but I was no longer faithful. I was a little worried because, as it turned out, Jack's father, Frank, was going to take part in the session as one of my lovers. I thought making love with my own father-in-law was wrong, but Steve patiently pointed out that he overheard him and Doug talking about our session, and instead of risking Frank telling Jack everything, they decided to include him. She asked for a drink, and Paul gave her a clear plastic cup of water from the vending machine. She thanked him and continued her story. In the end, it was Steve's turn. He was supposed to be my last lover in this morning's session. I remember screaming, "Steve, my husband is here." It was terrible. God, it was terrible. The look on his face. It broke my heart. I still see it in my nightmares. He stared at the mess that was spewing out of me and threw up on the carpet. A little bit got on Steve and my legs. I felt so humiliated, but I understood that for Jack, everything should have been much, much worse. He looked at me and screamed, "You were with everyone at the cricket club except me, you fool. Even with my own father." "Oh, Wendy, you're a fool. How could you?" Paul looked at her. "Well, that's exactly the question we need to answer, isn't it, Wendy? Why exactly did you do this? And can you learn a lesson to never do anything like that again?" She looked at him and shook her head. "Oh, is it possible?" "Yes," he replied. "With the right help and guidance, most things are possible." He looked at his watch and said, "This should be the end of our first session, Wendy. However, I would like to see you on the same day next week, at the same time. Is this possible for you?" She agreed. As she left, she realized that for some reason she was starting to feel a little better. In fact, she hadn't really counted on the consultation. But was she starting to feel that maybe this would be the best thing for her? Well, she could only hope. At the beginning of the next session, Paul helped her relax with a simple exercise, and then said, "Maybe you can tell me all about Sarah." He watched her closely and noticed that she was immediately agitated. "Why? What does this have to do with Sarah?" She spat out the name as if it tasted disgusting. Or maybe it was for her. Paul hesitated and said, "During our first session, did you say something about her being with your husband?" "What exactly?" "Oh, yes. You said, 'Jack came into the room with that damn little fool Sarah. It's all her damn fault.' Why is she a damn little fool? And why is it all her fault?" Wendy tried to contain her anger, but it was obvious to Paul that she was very angry with Sarah. He didn't think it was healthy and wanted to help Wendy explore it and deal with it. "She's been hanging around my husband for years, like an unpleasant smell. She was talking some nonsense about knowing that I was a cheater. He knows that, in the end, I will cheat on Jack. She put some recording devices in my car and purse. You know, I could sue her. Invasion of privacy. And she packed the cricket club with video cameras. It's all her damn fault. She was plotting to take my man away from me. And damn it, she also did it, the damn little cow." "Oh," Paul said, "so it's her fault, isn't it? And at what point? You didn't tell me that she was involved in your affair with Steve?" Wendy stared at him for a couple of seconds, her mouth agape, before she squeezed out an answer. "This is absurd. That's not what I meant. I mean, if she hadn't told my husband, if she hadn't videotaped our cricket club session, Jack and I would still be married. And she married him. And they have a child. It was supposed to be my baby. Mine. Not her." Paul noticed that she was starting to get furious and mentally sighed. It's always a problem when people in therapy tell themselves such stupid, frivolous lies. He turned to her sharply. "Wendy, think about it. Think about what you're saying." Wendy gasped and stared at him in horror. What do you mean?" He said, "Well, the thing is, Wendy, if Sarah hadn't told him then, how long would it have been until he eventually found out?" She looked scared. "But who could tell him?" Paul shook his head. "Drunken bragging that he could have overheard. a tearful confession of guilt by one of the participants. One of your lover's wives found out and told Jack. There are dozens of different scenarios, different ways Jack could figure it out. And I bet they had camera phones with them. Maybe a regular mini video camera too? She began to sob. My marriage didn't stand a chance, did it? Not after I got together with Steve. Paul shook his head. I'm not here to judge you, but to help you. But I think you've made a fair point here. He paused to collect his thoughts before speaking again. Why did Sarah decide that she has the ability to recognize a cheater? Do you know? Wendy calmed down and told Paul the story of how her parents cheated on each other and how it affected her. She seems to think it's given her the magical ability to spot cheaters. She chuckled. Paul looked at her. Well, Wendy, in your case, the magic worked. She really recognized you as a cheater. And you weren't wrong, were you? But how? How could she just find out? Paul nodded thoughtfully. You know, it's quite possible. Sometimes, when people go through a certain situation, their sense of awareness is heightened. Some people call this increased vigilance. So it's possible that as soon as you and Steve started a relationship, you showed signs of cheating, which she learned from her own parents. You know, Wendy, you'll never recover enough to move on as long as you hold this unjustified grudge against Sarah. But she's. You could have warned me. Would you believe her, Wendy? Wendy didn't say anything, but shook her head vigorously, realizing that she wouldn't have believed Sarah for a moment. Wendy, I'm going to do a special procedure with you to help you overcome your irrational antipathy to Sarah. Yes, she may have taken the opportunity to sneak in and get to your husband, but if you don't close the door, people will sneak in, you know? The treatment was a combination of several techniques, including cognitive therapy, a little NLP reprogramming, and several relaxation sessions. Eventually, after a few months, Wendy came to her senses and realized what she needed to do. I really need to fix the damage I've done to the village with my terrible words about Sarah. How can I do this without looking inadequate? Paul thought for a moment and said, just say, I was damn wrong about Sarah. She is a good girl and is very suitable for Jack. What happened is entirely my fault. How about this? And so, shortly before Harry's first anniversary, Wendy called Jack and Sarah, asking if she could come to them. They knew she was up to something, as she had been talking to people in the village for the past week, trying to make amends for talking about Sarah, and agreed to let Wendy visit at 15 o'clock the next day. She entered the living room of the cottage and looked at Jack. She was speechless, burst into tears and ran up to him, burying her face in his chest. He looked at Sarah with a worried expression on his face, but Sarah just shrugged her shoulders. I'm really sorry, Jack. It was my fault. I ruined our marriage. He pulled her close and gently hugged her. Calming her down, he invited her to sit down. Wendy turned her tear-stained face to Sarah. And Sarah, I'm sorry. You knew I was a cheater. And now I understand why. Paul, my therapist, explained everything. I realized that I was accusing you unfairly, shifting the blame. As he said, Sarah nodded, not knowing what to say. Wendy kept talking to them, the words almost bumping into each other. He tricked me. He said that I might have a hidden tendency to submit, and he suddenly discovered this in one session, shouting, "Pick up this pen." I did so, and then I wondered why I did it. He said it confirmed that I was a hidden submissive, prone to submission, that Steve had somehow caught on to it. When I asked him why Jack never did anything, unlike Steve, to take advantage of my tendency to submit, he said, the answer is simple. Jack loved you, and Steve lusted after you. He didn't care about you or what happened to you, as long as you let him have you in a loving way. Jack and Sarah asked her questions, listened carefully to the answers, and answered the questions. They had been chatting for an hour when young Harry woke up, demanding to be fed. After he was fed and calmed down, Sarah, on a sudden impulse, invited Wendy to hold Harry in her arms. From the look of surprise, joy, and agreement on Wendy's face, Sarah realized that she had done the right thing by letting Wendy hold Harry. Before Wendy eventually left, Sarah surprised Jack by saying, "Hey, Wendy, do you think you could come again? I think we need to talk some more. Tomorrow at 3 o'clock in the afternoon? Will it suit you?" Having agreed, Wendy took her leave. She realized that she would have something to talk about in a session with Paul the next morning. When I entered his office, I realized that he was excited. But what happened? She was immediately alarmed, and he was pacing back and forth. I understand that I can no longer be your therapist. I talked to my therapy mentor, and we both agreed that if you wanted, he could arrange for someone else to take care of your treatment. Why? She was upset. I thought we were doing so well. Too good, Wendy. You see, a therapist can't treat someone if they have a relationship with them. She shook her head, confused by this turn of events. But we don't have a relationship, do we? Isn't it? He grinned, took out a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses from behind his desk and said, "Well, this is exactly what I would like to discuss with you." She screamed with joy and jumped up to him. Of course, be careful not to break the bottle or glasses. They talked for an hour and realized that their relationship should develop slowly and naturally. Of course, when she arrived at the cottage, she was over the moon with happiness. And when Sarah asked Wendy if she would be willing to help them by becoming one of Harry's godparents at his christening, Wendy thought her heart would burst with joy. Wendy and Jack sold the house, and with their share of the resulting split in half, they and Paul pooled funds and bought a cottage located quite close to the house of Sarah, Jack, and her grandmother. But not too close. Not everything was smooth. One evening, when they were all sitting in the rest and quietly drinking, Steve, being drunk, went up to Paul and began to tell him all the details of the dirty events at the cricket club. Paul silently looked him up and down and said, "Huh, you must be Steve." Before Steve could react to this remark, Big John, the Cockney owner of the rest, grabbed Steve by the collar. "Hey, Steve, drop it, buddy. I've had enough of your shit for the rest of my life. You're going to play some Shakespeare, old man. You're banned." Steve was pushed out of the pub by the neck and landed awkwardly on the path, much to the delight of everyone except himself, of course. And he still didn't understand the joke about Shakespeare that Big John made up about him. But that's life. Jack was never able to get closer to his parents. The crack was too big. He tried to talk to them several times, but they sincerely saw nothing wrong with what they had done. His parents sold their house in the village, moved to the Kent coast, and did not take any part in the life of their grandchildren. But it was their loss. Sarah's grandmother was happy, so to speak, to intervene in the situation. Jack used the money left to him by his grandfather in a trust fund to buy out the family business from his father, so he was busy running it with the help of Sarah, who was now the company's IT guru. During an informal game at the cricket club, Jack asked Paul what he thought about his father. "In my opinion, if a guy makes love to his own daughter-in-law, it frighteningly looks like bad thoughts. And if you consider that, judging by the little you've told me, he took you off the board and replaced you with an iron lumberjack, then that's the result. He takes your job away from you, and then your wife. Because of what? Out of jealousy, of course. Since Paul had a vasectomy during his first marriage at the request of his wife, who ruined the marriage with her blatant infidelity, he and Wendy never had children. But Wendy was more than happy to remain Wendy's aunt to Jack and Sarah's children, ultimately for all 3 of them. And you know what? Life is still good.